Status quo. Imagine a time when there was no status quo. Now that seems ridiculous in some ways, but let me explain what I mean. I just passed a SoftBank store, the same place where I get my iPhone, and they had a sign on there showing the discount for the 16 gigabyte iPhone 4s. Nice deal. They were having a little sale of some sort. I've got the 32 gigabyte, and I was sitting there, I was looking at the phones, and I was thinking, 16 gigabytes, wow, 16 gigabytes, hey, it's nothing, you know, you need the 32 gigabytes, and then I thought for a second more, listen to yourself, Kurt. I mean, just a few years back, the concept of a gigabyte was an amazing thing. I remember when I was, you know, I sound like an old guy, you know. I remember back in the day, you know, my first computer with a mega, you know, what was it, 100 megabytes. Wow, that was big. And the first one, you know, got to a gigabyte. That was a spectacular thing. And now we're talking about little phones with 32 gigabytes. So anyway, you guys understand that point. You know, we live in an age where technology in particular is progressing at such a rate, nothing is the same for very long. And the result is one generation is very different in its expectations and understanding than the next. See this old woman on the side of the road? The world that she grew up in here in Japan is very different from the world that these boys here, see the little boys right here on the side? It's a very different world from the world that they know now and that they will know as adults. And thus and so on. And we take that for granted as you know, citizens of the modern world. Anybody, especially in the first world, takes that pretty much for granted that each generation will not recognize the world of its grandchildren or even its children. But that's therefore the status quo. The status quo is constantly changing for the modern human beings. But that wasn't always the case, and Japan's a great place to look at that. Now, I'm no expert on Japanese history or culture or anything. I'm not an expert on anything, but I have, in my old business, I have studied the culture enough to think I can make a rather general description here that I think might be accurate. Especially during a period of time, especially the Edo period in Japan, also called the Tokugawa period, 1600 to 1868, a long period of peace in Japan where lifestyle and culture was highly regulated, and the structure of society with the different classes and the guilds and basically the trades and the like, and strong restrictions on many things, aspects of life, in order to basically hold things in place. The government, the Tokugawa shogunate, issued a lot of laws that basically kept things, maintained the status quo at a non-changing level. There weren't this was the time, the Edo period was a time when Japan was basically frozen in terms of many technologies and industries. There were changes, but they moved at a snail's pace compared to what we know now. As a result, during the Edo period, it's quite likely that a grandparent, you know, an old man or an old woman, would have finished off their life in a village or a community that resembled in appearance and behavior the same type of village that they knew as a child. There would have been very little change. You know, structures would have changed, the progression of buildings, but maybe a few little modern architectural changes here and there, but for the most part, very minimum. They could relate. You know, can you imagine being, you know, an oldster and being able to relate to the young people's world. Now, there may be some fashion changes and some vocabulary changes. I'm sure that was the case. I'm sure young people had their little ways to make themselves distinct, and they spoke in certain ways that did that. But for the most part, the outward appearance of society would have been the same. That old person that we saw just a while ago is walking through a world right now full of devices and buildings and technologies and vehicles that for the most part are completely alien to that person's experience. So the status quo is something that we expect as modern citizens to be a changing thing. We don't expect the world to be the same when we're old, but there was a time in this country, Japan, where the status quo there was no status quo. There just was what there was. The status quo, the status quo was forever what it was, or not forever, but at least in terms of the perspective of a lifetime. There you go. Now I'm headed into the mountains. Have a great day. Bye bye, everybody. Hope your status quo is great.